I'm going to focus on 5 aspects of the Armenian genocide and compare that to the ongoing Rohingya genocide, where I'm doing some of my work now. And hopefully in that discussion, then talk about lessons that have been learned or not learned, or what we need to learn. And I want to, from the outset, mention that I'm not going to be talking about the justice component to it, which probably would be natural for a lawyer to talk about. But the reason why is because I have, with my colleagues, already published a chapter in a book called The Historical Origins of International Criminal Law, and it was published by TOEP, and it was in, I think, in 2014. And actually, our position in that chapter, which I know probably would be controversial for some people, is that the trials, the court-martial trials that took place after what we say is after the Armenian genocide, actually laid the foundations for international criminal justice and most likely inspired Nuremberg and what happened thereafter. And so we actually take the position that the Armenian genocide influenced and had a great influence in what we now call international criminal justice. And even in Lemkin's work, he definitely looked to the Armenian genocide in addition to settler colonial genocides that were going on. And so we can't really pinpoint. I think sometimes the history of what we're looking at needs to actually go back further. So what I do want to focus on is really more of kind of geopolitical, diplomatic dimensions of this. And I think it's important to do that, because I think what we come out with is a very similar situation that's ongoing. And I think that that's why the Armenian genocide is so crucial for many people to really understand and to really learn from, no matter how they learn from it, but it's important to learn. So the 5 points that I take away from it, and I just broadly take these points. Obviously, we would need probably a year to talk about every single point in depth. But the first point is dehumanization, which I appreciate Professor Lingus talking about. And that is really one aspect of a whole body when it happens, the crime of genocide. And dehumanization during the Armenian genocide, my position on this is that many scholars will take a look at the year 1915 and begin a discussion about Armenia then. What my position is actually that the dehumanization starts way before that. If you look at the way that the Armenians were treated, kind of sold as chattel, the same way you would sell sheep, the way that they were denigrated, and the role that the Ottoman Empire kind of relegated to them. Even if some Armenians were prosperous during that time before the Young Turks take power, there is still that facet of dehumanization starts way before 1915, and especially under the Sultan, who was looking to probably consolidate his power. And the second point that we take from the Armenian genocide would be the growing role of nationalism and how that played into the Armenian genocide. And so during that time, we look at Ottomanization, or Ottomanization. It's kind of a hard word for me to say. But that nationalism really played a huge part in mobilizing different groups to go out and mass murder the Armenians in the name of a political agenda, and definitely in trying to create whatever the Ottoman Empire thought was going to be appropriate according to their vision. The third point is propaganda. And I think too many times this gets overlooked when we talk about genocide. But propaganda in terms of the Armenian genocide, we see that the Armenians were blamed for uprisings, that they were aligned with the Russians, that they were doing things to destabilize the empire. And they actually, in many of the archives that outside of the ones from the Ottoman Empire archives, we see, or Turkish archives, we see that a lot of the propaganda that the Ottoman Empire would say there was a revolt, or that they were revolting and the Armenians were behind it. And a lot of these other countries, even the Germans, who I'm about to talk about next, said, we don't have any evidence of that, we don't see that. And so that's not really what we are. But this issue of propaganda was to substantiate all the other things that they were doing. The fourth point is really aiding and abetting, and what I call people who, or regional powers, or powers that were aiding and abetting. And in this case, I specifically focus on Germany, who played a really big part in wanting to push and their geopolitical agenda, especially in trying to remove Britain and Russia from any sphere of influence that they were trying to get. So they were using the Ottoman Empire as a strategic tool in order to expand their power base. But not only that, but the Germans also actually paid a lot of gold to the Ottoman Empire to allow them to initiate their agenda. And there was a lot of training that went back and forth between the Ottoman Empire and the Germans. So we see a lot of shared support that comes from a power that ends up really endorsing the mass murder, killings, and everything else that we see of the Armenian people, and definitely other minority groups. And then finally, the last point and the fifth point is acts. And this, there seems to be a lot written about that. And when we look at the acts, what I'm talking about is simply, well, not simply, but simply things like human trafficking, what we call forced deportation, which was really a euphemism for mass slaughter, clearance operations, which was really a euphemism for making sure that the territory and lands could be confiscated and put back into the control of the Ottoman Empire. The destruction of churches, the confiscation of relics, the theft of property, sexual slavery, child trafficking, and then of course, policies and plans that limit rights and gave the Armenians and other minority groups no voices or rights, and particularly that which would hurt family structures, like not being able to produce a family in the future. So with those 5 points, dehumanization, nationalism, propaganda, the role of regional or other powers, and then acts, if you take those 5 points and you apply it to what we're seeing now, we'll see that the same type of things are actually happening again. And I think a distinction has to be made between what I'm saying and the warning signs to genocide that Professor Lingus mentioned, because the warning signs are really meant to make sure that we protect groups before they even meet any of the actual acts of genocide. But as we're seeing in many parts of the world, we're way too late. And it's because we're ignoring things and we assume that maybe they're trivial, or maybe we just aren't putting the right attention on those actions. So for the Rohingya, we're seeing exactly the same things play out, very parallel to that of the Armenians. The difference, of course, is that it's a different ethnic, racial, national definitely group, and definite religious group. Although the Rohingya have mixed religions in them, including Hindus and Christians. So with the Rohingya in the 1960s, we see the dehumanization process start after the takeover of the Tatmadaw. The military takes over control over Burma, and then we start seeing different things, laws that are passed that basically relegate the Rohingya to nobodies in their own lands. We see purges. There's actually 3 purges, and 2017 was actually the 3rd purge that happened. And this dehumanization process, unfortunately and sadly, is ignored by many people who are working on the Rohingya genocide, in the sense that they only look to the events of 2017, maybe maximum they'll go to 2012. But this is a mistake. And just like the mistake that's being made when we analyze the Armenian genocide, we have to look back to see where it is that the propaganda and all that stuff is really stemming from, in order to come up with better solutions for that. And so through the dehumanization process, we'll find that there are actually laws in place that keep the structure of dehumanization in place for the Rohingya. The second part, for nationalism, instead of Ottomanization, we're seeing Burmanization, which is the policy of the Tatmadaw and the Myanmar government, which is to have a state that is entirely Buddhist. And so obviously the Rohingya don't fit into that picture. The third point, which is propaganda, we see the Rohingya have been labeled terrorists. And as I always tell the Rohingya that I work with, the Myanmar government has had 50 to 60 years to perfect propaganda. And so the victims and survivors are now catching up in order to counter that propaganda, because they never were able, even when they were able to do that, obviously our technology has changed. So you can send messages on WhatsApp now, you can record things that you never were able to before probably. And those dynamics and those pictures are probably making a difference, but it's 50 years, they have a lead on that kind of stuff. And so this kind of, labeling of them as terrorists, the fact that they're foreigners, because they sided with the British during the colonial era. All this kind of stuff feeds into the propaganda that the Rohingya are not people who are native to Burma. And then we have aiders and betters. And the case of the Rohingya is a little bit, we know a little bit more than I think in Armenia. And I would be curious to ask people who've been researching the Armenian genocide for quite some time, but we know for a fact that there are corporations that are playing a role in the Rohingya genocide. I think there isn't really a whole lot of literature from what I see on the types of corporations that played a role during the Armenian genocide. Most likely banks that were holding money for the Ottoman Empire and things like that were probably fine. But in terms of the Rohingya, we do see corporations, there is corporate pressure being put on them. And we do have two major regional players who I'm gonna let you guess who they are, who have a staked interest in the Arakan in that region because they wanna develop the resources there. They wanna be able to take it and use it for their power and to gain more ground within Asia. So there are people who are supporting this kind of behavior and of course, supporting the genocide. And then in terms of acts, I won't reiterate, but this because the fact-finding mission report that Professor Lingus refers to has enumerated amounts of acts. I think even that report is missing a whole lot because there is, again, not a whole lot of perspective on what happens before 2012. And we know that systematic human trafficking, the enslavement of people, forced labor, women and children who are constantly raped, and we see the murder of intellectuals. During the 2017 purge, we see mass graves, and those graves, the evidence of those being destroyed by the Tatmadaw by pouring acid on it. And even recently, they've been doing that because of not wanting to be able to hand over evidence to the International Court of Justice, most likely than not. But really trying to make sure that none of the evidence exists and wiping it clear of the existence of the Rohingya to further substantiate the fact that they are foreigners. So I think there's a lot of commonalities, and what I find when I take a look at and work on matters related to genocide is that I find that victim and survivor groups tend to kind of silo themselves off and not realize that they have many shared experiences with other groups, which I think is really important. And so in terms of the lessons learned, I don't think we've learned a whole lot. I don't think we're putting into practice what we are learning. And I think that that's really the crux of the point I want to make here. And what I do want to say is one of the biggest lessons is we have not addressed the root of a lot of our issues that we're looking at. When it comes to the Armenian genocide, we're still seeing a lot of hate speech spewed towards the Armenians, a lot of misunderstanding and misinformation, and people see it as an insult to their nationalism if you acknowledge something like this. And it's the same thing with the Rohingya genocide, it's really, the root cause of it is really laws that were in place, propaganda that took place to dehumanize the group. And I think we have to work backwards so very far in order to work on that and then solve the issues from that. And then the other lesson that I think we need to really figure out is how much are we really going to allow as people to allow geopolitics to intervene in our quest for justice. And I, personally speaking, do not think that justice is a one-size-fits-all solution. I think every group has to ask for what they want, and every group will ask for something different because every group needs something different. So in Guatemala, the Remy report, as the last speaker just mentioned, they had a truth commission sanctioned by the UN. The Catholic Church did the Remy report, and there's still trials that go on to this day. And they were able to try a leader for their crimes. And perhaps that is still not enough, and those victims and survivors want more. And I think it's fair that even in the question of Armenia and things and other genocides, that we really ask what the survivors and victims are looking for, and we pursue those options. So with that, I'm going to stop so we can have a really great discussion. And I thank you for inviting me. Thank you.